They ridiculed his tough guy persona to his face, laughing, as if his decades of work meant nothing. His voice dropped to that iconic quiet intensity words of hard-earned wisdom that no one expected. A liberal reporter thought she could humiliate Sylvester Stallone, but his response left the entire room speechless. The Beverly Hills Hotel ballroom glittered with the practiced shine of Hollywood royalty. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light across tables adorned with white orchids and fine china. The annual Veterans and Film Foundation Gala was the kind of event where reputations were made, deals were whispered between champagne sips, and the line between charity and publicity blurred like watercolors in the rain. This was Hollywood at its most Hollywood, a careful choreography of fame and influence where even the sincerity felt rehearsed. Everyone played their part to perfection. The stars smiled for cameras, executives nodded at appropriate moments. The wealthy wrote checks for good causes while silently calculating the tax benefits. But Sylvester Stallone didn't play by those rules. He never had. At 77 years old, he moved through the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. His black tuxedo was impeccably tailored, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. Alert, watchful, seasoned. They carried the weight of decades in the industry, years of being underestimated before Rocky, of being dismissed as just another action star, of creating characters that critics mocked but audiences embraced. Tonight, those eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on a small group of veterans gathered near the bar. Men and women whose military service had led them to careers in film. People Hollywood typically hired as consultants then conveniently forgot to credit. Stallone made his way toward them. No entourage, no fanfare, just a purposeful stride and a genuine smile. The kind that reached his eyes, the kind you can't rehearse. He shook hands with each veteran, not the quick political handshakes of networking, but the firm, authentic grip of equals. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers, his focus absolute as if these conversations were the only reason he had come. Across the room, Maya Stevens watched him intently. At 29, she was the youngest feature writer for The Progressive Voice, a digital media outlet known for its sharp takes on what they called problematic icons. Maya had built her reputation on takedown pieces of aging celebrities whose comments or careers she deemed out of step with modern values. Her articles generated reliable traffic, social media heat, and the kind of controversy that translated to advertising dollars. She had come to the gala with a purpose, not to support veterans, not to enjoy the evening, but to confront Stallone, to create a moment that would go viral, to prove that another relic of toxic masculinity deserved to be retired from public consciousness. She straightened her midnight blue dress, checked her phone's recorder, and mentally rehearsed the questions she had carefully crafted to provoke a reaction. Questions about violence in his films, about masculine stereotypes, about politics. She had studied his previous interviews, looking for weak spots, moments where he had shown flashes of temper. She was certain she could push him over the edge, make him reveal himself as exactly the kind of man her readers already believed him to be. After all, wasn't he just another aging action star clinging to relevance? Another man who had profited from glorifying violence, another throwback to an era best left behind. Maya was going to expose him, and her career would soar. She took a sip of champagne, liquid courage, and began moving through the crowd toward her target. She didn't notice how Stallone listened to a female veteran describing her documentary project, didn't see the way he nodded with genuine interest, didn't register his offer to help with funding. She saw only what she had come to see, an outdated icon ripe for a public reckoning. The room seemed to slow as she approached, her heartbeat quickening with anticipation. A waiter passed with a tray of hors d'oeuvre. Someone laughed too loudly at a mediocre joke. The orchestra transitioned to a new melody. Details Maya barely registered. She was too focused on what was about to happen, on the story she would craft from this encounter. "Excuse me, Mr. Stallone." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Stallone turned slightly, that famous profile now facing her directly. The veteran he'd been speaking with paused mid-sentence. "I'm Maya Stevens from The Progressive Voice," she continued, her press badge prominently displayed. "I'd love to ask you a few questions about your work and its impact." There was something in the phrasing, a slight edge to impact, that signaled her intentions. Stallone's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition perhaps. He had been in this industry long enough to recognize an ambush when he saw one. "I'm in the middle of a conversation," he said, gesturing to the veteran, his voice that familiar rumble, but Maya wasn't deterred. "It'll just take a moment," she pressed, smiling with practiced charm. "I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on how your films have shaped masculine identity and whether you feel any responsibility for the more problematic aspects," she emphasized, problematic just enough to make her position clear. A few heads turned in their direction. The veteran shifted uncomfortably, sensing the confrontation brewing. Stallone studied Maya for a moment, the room around them continuing its elegant rotation of small talk and networking. But in this small bubble, a tension was building. He could have walked away, could have dismissed her with a word, could have had security intervene. He was Sylvester Stallone, after all, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood history. He didn't owe this young reporter anything, certainly not a response to thinly veiled accusations masquerading as interview questions. But something else happened instead, something that neither Maya nor the growing audience now watching the exchange had expected. Stallone turned fully toward her, creating a space in the conversation, his expression not angry, not defensive, but thoughtful, almost curious. "You know," he said quietly, "I get what you're trying to do here." Maya blinked, her script momentarily disrupted. This wasn't the reaction she had anticipated. "I'm just asking questions that people want answers to," she recovered quickly, her phone recording every word, every inflection. "Are you?" he asked. There was no accusation in it, just a simple question that somehow cut through her practiced confidence. "Because it sounds like you already have the answers you want to hear." The veteran behind him suppressed a smile. A few onlookers moved closer, drawn by the exchange. Maya felt her cheeks warm, but she pressed on. This was her moment. "I think your films, particularly the Rambo series, have contributed to a culture of toxic masculinity that we're still trying to unpack today." She said it boldly, directly, the kind of statement designed to provoke, to generate headlines. Young reporter confronts. Stallone about toxic legacy. She could already see the social shares, the comments, the engagement metrics. But what happened next, what Sylvester Stallone said in response, would change everything, not just about this encounter, but about how everyone in that room and millions online would think about him and about the culture wars that had become America's favorite blood sport. His response was coming, and nobody was prepared for it. The studio of the intellectual hour was designed to intimidate. Everything from the lighting to the seating arrangement was carefully crafted to give Rebecca Chen and her panel the upper hand. Unlike most talk shows with their comfortable sofas and coffee tables, Chen's set resembled an academic tribunal, her desk elevated slightly, backed by bookcases filled with intellectual tomes. Her guests seated lower in a semicircle as if facing a dissertation committee. The lighting was precise, illuminating the panel warmly while casting subtle shadows on the guest side of the stage, a psychological edge that most never noticed consciously. Tonight, the studio hummed with anticipation. 200 audience members, many of them graduate students from nearby universities, sat eagerly in their seats, phones ready despite the no recording policy. They had been selected carefully for their intellectual bent, for their skepticism of tech billionaires, for their readiness to react with knowing chuckles at the right moments. Behind the scenes, the production team moved with purpose. This wasn't just another episode. This was the one they had been planning since the show's inception 3 years earlier. Taking down Elon Musk, the self-proclaimed genius. The man who had convinced the world he was a revolutionary innovator when they believed he was simply a savvy businessman with good timing. The control room buzzed with activity. 7 cameras positioned strategically to capture every micro-expression, every moment of discomfort, every bead of sweat that might appear when Musk was cornered. "Camera 3, stay tight on his eyes," the director instructed. "That's where we'll see it when he starts to crack." They had studied hours of footage, mapping his patterns, his tendencies under pressure, the slight tick in his right eye when uncomfortable, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence when unsure. These would be their telltale signs of victory. Dr. Miranda Jeffries adjusted her glasses, reviewing her notes one final time. She had spent months investigating Musk's companies, interviewing former employees, collecting anecdotes of his technical limitations. Her book, Billionaire Myths, had dedicated an entire chapter to what she called the Musk phenomenon, arguing that his success came not from genius, but from capitalizing on others' innovations. To her left, Dr. James Whitman scrolled through equations on his tablet, refreshing the complex physics he planned to reference to expose Musk's superficial understanding. His Princeton colleagues had laughed when he mentioned the upcoming interview. Ask him about modal analysis of orbital dynamics, one had suggested, or the quantum efficiency limits in photovoltaic materials. Surely a man without formal training would stumble on such technical questions. Tanya Rodriguez tapped her pen rhythmically against her notepad. Her Pulitzer, displayed prominently on her website biography, gave her questions additional weight. She had brought down CEOs before, exposed corporate malfeasance, revealed the gap between public claims and private realities. Tonight would be her biggest target yet. Chen herself projected perfect confidence, hair and makeup impeccable, her Yale and Columbia degrees mentioned prominently in her introduction. Her questions organized on index cards, color-coded by topic with follow-ups ready depending on Musk's responses, or rather, his expected failures to respond adequately. In the green room, Elon Musk sat alone. He had declined the usual pre-interview small talk, the offer of refreshments, the attempt to make him comfortable. Instead, he had requested just 15 minutes to review some notes on his phone. The production assistant assigned to him reported back to the producer. He's just sitting there, scrolling through something, doesn't seem nervous at all. The producer frowned. Is he prepping answers? The assistant shrugged. Can't tell, but he didn't bring any team with him. No PR people, no assistants, just himself. This wasn't the usual approach for a high-profile guest, especially one about to face such a challenging panel. Most came with entourages, with media trainers, with prepared talking points. Musk had arrived alone, in an understated Tesla, driven by himself. The simplicity of it had momentarily unsettled the producer, though he quickly dismissed the feeling. On the monitors, the audience was being prepped, the warm-up comedian instructing them when to applaud, highlighting the prestigious backgrounds of Chen and her panel, subtly positioning Musk as the outsider, the pretender among experts. We have over 12 advanced degrees on our panel tonight, he said with exaggerated impression. And then, we have a guy who spent 2 whole days at Stanford. The audience laughed right on cue, setting the tone for what was to come. The floor director appeared at the green room door. 5 minutes, Mr. Musk. Musk looked up from his phone, nodded once, but said nothing, his expression giving away nothing of what he might be thinking, as he slipped his phone into his pocket and stood, straightening the simple dark jacket he wore over a black t-shirt. No tie, no pocket square, none of the trappings that usually signaled wealth and position. In the studio, the pre-show music began, a classical piece chosen to signal seriousness, intellectual gravity. The panel took their positions, arranging notes, adjusting microphones, exchanging quick, reassuring glances. They had prepared for this, rehearsed their questions, anticipated his responses. There was no way he could match their combined expertise. Chen received a final touch of powder from a makeup artist, then nodded to the floor director. The red lights on the cameras illuminated. 30 seconds, came the call. The audience settled, the energy in the room focusing like a lens concentrating sunlight. Chen straightened her posture, the perfect image of journalistic authority, as the countdown continued. 15 seconds, 10 seconds, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The show's theme music swelled. Cameras panned across the impressive set before settling on Chen, who gazed directly into the main camera with practiced intensity. Welcome to the intellectual hour, her voice carrying the perfect blend of warmth and authority as she delivered her opening lines, introducing the topic, framing the conversation, establishing the intellectual credentials of her distinguished panel in careful contrast to the limited formal education of their guest. And then, it was time. Please welcome Elon Musk. The applause was polite but restrained, as instructed, as Musk walked onto the set, cameras following his movement, the audience studying him, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed skepticism. He moved without hurry, taking his seat in the guest position, the lighting subtly highlighting the panel's faces while leaving his slightly shadowed, a small psychological edge. He seemed not to notice, or perhaps not to care. The initial questions began, softballs designed to create a false sense of security. Questions about recent launches, stock prices, market competition. Musk answered easily, concisely, without elaboration. Chen exchanged a quick glance with Dr. Whitman, not quite the verbose self-promotion they had expected. But the night was young. The real questions were still to come. The audience leaned forward slightly, sensing the shift as Chen's tone changed almost imperceptibly, her posture straightening as she prepared to begin the real interview, the one they had all come to see, the takedown of a man they believed had fooled the world into thinking he was a genius, when to them he was merely a showman with good marketing and impeccable timing. The trap was set, the stage was prepared, the players were in position. What they didn't realize was that the man they planned to expose might be playing an entirely different game, one they hadn't prepared for, one they couldn't anticipate. As Chen leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly, ready to spring the first real trap, Musk's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, something none of the cameras caught, a quiet readiness that might have warned them had any of them been looking for the right signs. Rebecca Chen leaned forward, her posture shifting subtly from conversational to prosecutorial. "So, Elon, let's talk about your background," she began, her tone deceptively casual. "You're widely described as a genius, an innovator changing multiple industries, yet your formal education is relatively limited compared to most tech leaders." The trap was being set, piece by careful piece. 2 days at Stanford before dropping out. No advanced degree in physics, engineering, or computer science. She paused for effect, allowing the contrast to sink in. How do you respond to critics who suggest that perhaps your reputation for technical brilliance is more about marketing than actual expertise? The audience stirred, sensing the first real challenge. Dr. Whitman leaned forward slightly, eager to follow up on any weakness. Musk considered the question, his expression unchanged. "Education comes in many forms," he replied evenly. "I've always been an autodidact, learning through reading, doing, and building." Chen smiled thinly, exactly the response they had anticipated. "Yes, but surely there's a difference between reading about rocket science and actually having the technical training that NASA engineers receive." Dr. Jeffries jumped in, right on cue. "If I may add to that," her voice carrying the practiced authority of decades in academia, "in my research on tech leadership, I've found a pattern of self-taught entrepreneurs overestimating their technical understanding, especially in complex fields like aerospace." She adjusted her glasses, a gesture she used when delivering what she considered a decisive point. SpaceX employs brilliant engineers with advanced degrees from MIT, Caltech, Stanford. Yet, in interviews, you discuss the technical details as if these innovations were primarily yours. The audience murmured approvingly, recognizing the implied criticism. Musk nodded slightly. "Our achievements at SpaceX are absolutely team efforts," he acknowledged. "But leading those teams requires deep technical understanding, not just management skills." Rodriguez seized the opening. "Yet, former employees have suggested that you sometimes overrule actual experts based on limited understanding, particularly in engineering decisions." She referenced her notepad, a journalist's prop to suggest meticulous research. "One former Tesla engineer described you as dangerously confident in areas where his knowledge is superficial." The quote hung in the air, a direct challenge to his competence. Chen smiled slightly. The panelists were executing perfectly, building on each other's points, creating a seamless narrative of a man out of his intellectual depth. "Would you say that's accurate?" she pressed. "That your confidence sometimes exceeds your actual technical expertise?" Musk considered the question. "Confidence and competence aren't mutually exclusive," he replied, his voice still measured, still calm. "I've found that many so-called experts can be trapped by conventional thinking, by the limitations of their specialized training." Dr. Whitman scoffed audibly. "That sounds like a convenient way to dismiss those who actually understand the physics or engineering challenges when they disagree with you." He leaned forward, fingers steepled, the gesture of an academic about to deliver a lecture. "Let's take rocket engineering specifically, since you claim deep understanding there." He glanced at his notes. "You've made statements about the innovation of SpaceX's Raptor engine that many aerospace and NIA looked interested." "That's actually a fascinating question," he said, the hint of a smile touching his lips. The Raptor engine's innovation isn't just one element, but an integration of several design approaches. Dr. Whitman nodded patronizingly. Yes, I'm sure it's very complicated, he interrupted. Perhaps too complicated to explain without your engineers present? The bait was obvious, an invitation to either retreat or overreach. Musk's expression didn't change. Not at all, he replied calmly. I'd be happy to walk through the specific innovations in our combustion chamber design, including our approach to fuel-oxygen mixing, our cooling system architecture, and the material science challenges we solved. He paused briefly. Would you like me to start with the theoretical principles or the practical engineering challenges? Dr. Whitman blinked, momentarily caught off guard. This wasn't the fumbling response they had anticipated. Chen jumped in quickly. Before we get too technical, she said, recalibrating, let's address something more fundamental. She glanced at her index cards, moving to the next line of attack. You've described yourself as a physicist at heart, yet many actual physicists have questioned your understanding of basic principles. She looked directly at him. Dr. Neil Simmons from MIT recently said, your statements about quantum mechanics show profound misunderstanding of the subject. She let the accusation land. How do you respond to actual scientists who find your scientific claims problematic? It was a clever pivot, away from the specific engineering question that Musk seemed too comfortable with, toward broader scientific criticism. Dr. Jeffries nodded along. And this pattern appears across disciplines, she added. Your claims about artificial intelligence have been criticized by leading AI researchers, your neuroscience statements questioned by neurologists, your solar technology claims challenged by material scientists. She spread her hands, a gesture of apparent reasonableness. Do you see how this creates the impression that you're a dilettante rather than a deep thinker? Someone skimming across the surface of complex fields rather than truly understanding them? The audience murmured agreement. The framing resonated with them, reinforced their pre-existing suspicions. Rodriguez pressed further. And there's a real consequence to this. Her tone serious, concerned. When you make pronouncements on complex subjects, markets move, investments flow, based on your perceived expertise. She leaned forward. Don't you have a responsibility to be more humble about the limitations of your scientific understanding? The three-pronged attack was complete. His intellectual credibility challenged, his integrity questioned, his social responsibility criticized, all at once from three different angles. Chen watched carefully, certain they had him cornered, that now, finally, he would crack, show the defensive anger, the insecurity beneath the confidence. The audience was perfectly still. Camera zoomed in, capturing what was supposed to be his moment of exposure. But Musk remained calm, studying each of his challengers in turn, a slight smile still playing at his lips, something that might almost be amusement or perhaps recognition. It seems we've reached the heart of the matter, he said finally, his voice quiet but clear, carrying easily through the silent studio. And I appreciate the directness of your questions. Chen frowned slightly, confused by his composure, by the lack of defensiveness. This wasn't how targets usually responded to their carefully crafted ambushes. If I understand correctly, Musk continued, you're essentially asking if I'm an intellectual fraud. He stated it plainly, without anger or offense. If my understanding of physics, engineering, AI, and other fields is superficial, despite my company's successes in those areas. He looked directly at Chen. Is that a fair summary of your question? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes, essentially, she admitted. Many wonder if your companies succeed despite your involvement, not because of it. If your actual contribution is marketing and vision rather than technical innovation. Musk nodded thoughtfully. That's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. His response surprised them all. There was no defensiveness, no anger, just calm acknowledgement. And it deserves a thoughtful answer. He settled back slightly in his chair, seemingly relaxed despite being surrounded by hostile questioners. Would you mind if I took a moment to give you a complete response? Chen glanced at her producer, who nodded slightly. This was unexpected, but perhaps he was about to talk himself into a corner, give them even more material to work with. Please do, she said, gesturing for him to continue. Take all the time you need. What she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that they had just invited him to completely dismantle their carefully constructed narrative. Because Elon Musk hadn't come unprepared, He had simply been waiting for precisely this moment as he began to speak. The entire dynamic of the interview was about to change in ways none of them had anticipated. For a moment, Elon Musk's gaze seemed to drift, not from uncertainty, but as if accessing memories long filed away but never forgotten. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, more personal, less the CEO, more the person behind the persona. "When I was 10 years old," he began, his slight accent more noticeable now, "I read every book on physics in the Pretoria Public Library, not because anyone made me, but because I needed to understand how the universe works." Chen shifted slightly, confused by this unexpected direction. This wasn't the defensive response they had anticipated. By 12, I had taught myself programming, sold my first commercial software at 12, built rockets and homemade explosives, much to my mother's concern. A few chuckles from the audience, not mocking now, but genuine, recognizing the universal parental worry about curious children. I wasn't trying to become successful. I was trying to understand how things work at a fundamental level. His eyes refocused on the panel. That curiosity, that need to understand from first principles, that's been the constant in my life. Not credentials, not recognition. Dr. Whitman started to interrupt, but Musk continued, his voice still calm but steady. "When I was considering where to focus my energy after Zip2 and PayPal, I spent months reading textbooks, scientific journals, technical manuals in 3 areas: sustainable energy, space exploration, and artificial intelligence." He leaned forward slightly. Not as a dilettante skimming the surface, but 18 hours a day, filling notebooks with calculations, with questions, with ideas. He reached for the water glass beside him, took a small sip. The studio completely silent now. "I spoke with experts in each field not to steal their ideas, but to understand where conventional thinking might be wrong or incomplete." Dr. Jeffries frowned. This narrative contradicted her carefully constructed critique. "At SpaceX in the early days, we couldn't afford to hire the top NASA engineers, so I had to become fluent enough in orbital mechanics, propulsion systems, materials science, control theory to make the critical design decisions myself." His gaze shifted to Dr. Whitman. "I spent thousands of hours learning rocket engineering, not from Wikipedia articles, but from textbooks by Husel and Huang, from Soviet rocket manuals I had translated from Russian, from conversations with Tom Mueller and other propulsion experts." The audience was perfectly still now, the atmosphere in the studio shifting as Musk continued his story. "There was a night in 2008. His voice grew quieter, more reflective. "When both Tesla and SpaceX were on the verge of bankruptcy, I had invested my last dollar, was sleeping on friends' couches while trying to keep both companies alive." He paused, the memory clearly still vivid. "That night, I found myself recalculating the thrust equations for the Merlin engine, looking for efficiencies we had missed. Not as the CEO, but as an engineer, because we couldn't afford to be wrong." Rodriguez glanced down at her notes, finding her carefully prepared questions suddenly inadequate. "NASA engineers later told me they were shocked by my understanding of propulsion dynamics, not because I had credentials, but because I had done the work, had learned it from fundamental principles, had questioned every assumption." Dr. Whitman shifted uncomfortably. "At Tesla, similar story," Musk continued. "When we were designing the Roadster, I spent months understanding battery chemistry, power electronics, motor design, not at a surface level, but deeply enough to make the critical architectural decisions." He looked directly at Chen now. "I don't claim to know everything. No single person could across so many complex fields. But I do claim to understand the core principles, the fundamental physics and engineering that underlie our innovations." His expression remained calm, without defensiveness or arrogance, just stating what he considered facts. "There was a moment in 2012, he recalled, when we were struggling with the Model S production line. I literally moved into the factory, slept on the floor, and worked alongside our engineers to solve problems in real time." He gestured slightly with his hand. "Not giving orders from an office neurosurgeon obviously, but to understand the interface challenges between technology and neural tissue, to ask the right questions, to push past conventional limitations." He looked at each panelist in turn. "My point is not to boast, but to explain a simple truth that perhaps challenges our conventional understanding of expertise." He leaned forward slightly. "Deep understanding doesn't always come from formal education. Sometimes it comes from obsessive self-study, from thousands of hours asking questions, running experiments, calculating, failing, recalculating. Dr. Jeffries started to speak, then stopped, recognizing something authentic in what they were hearing. I remember a meeting with top AI researchers, Musk continued, where I questioned their assumptions about reinforcement learning approaches. They were initially dismissive until we got into the mathematical details, and they realized I had actually read and understood their research papers, not just the abstracts or conclusions. He smiled slightly. Their surprise was similar to yours now, because we've created this false dichotomy between formal credentials and actual understanding. The studio remained silent as his words settled, challenging not just their questions but their entire framework. I had a professor at Penn, he said after a moment, his tone reflective again, who told me something I never forgot. He said, "Elon, you talk about physics like it's a language you grew up speaking, not something you learned in a classroom." He nodded slightly. He understood what many miss, that for some people, understanding how the universe works isn't an academic exercise. It's an existential need. Chen found herself nodding, almost unconsciously, responding to the authenticity in his voice. When the first Falcon rockets were failing, Musk continued, I didn't delegate the problem. I immersed myself in the data, slept at the factory, worked directly with the engineers, recalculating trajectories, burn rates, structural loads, aerodynamic stresses. He looked at Dr. Whitman, not as a manager checking boxes, but as someone who needed to understand the physics and engineering at a fundamental level. He paused again, letting the words settle. This isn't about ego, it's about necessity. When you're trying to do things that haven't been done before, conventional expertise isn't always enough. You need to understand from first principles, need to question every assumption, need to see connections across disciplinary boundaries. The audience was completely still, many leaning forward now, including some who had come expecting to witness his humiliation. There's a difference, he said quietly, between credential-based authority and understanding-based authority, between knowing something because you were taught it and knowing something because you figured it out yourself. He looked around the studio, meeting eyes in the audience, connecting with them directly. I have profound respect for academic expertise, for the depth of knowledge that comes from specialized study. Most of my companies would be impossible without the brilliant PhDs we employ. He nodded toward the panel, acknowledging their credentials. But I've found that breakthroughs often happen at the intersection of disciplines, where specialized experts rarely venture, where someone with broader understanding can see connections others miss. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the studio continued to shift from hostile skepticism to something else entirely, something unexpected, something genuine. Chen watched as her carefully constructed narrative began to crumble, not through defensiveness or anger, but through a story that rang with authenticity, that challenged their assumptions not just about Elon Musk, but about the nature of expertise itself. And what came next would completely transform what they thought they knew about the man sitting before them. Elon Musk took a small sip of water, his gaze moving from the personal memories back to the present moment, to the panelists who had come expecting to expose him, but now found themselves unexpectedly exposed instead. So to address your specific question about the Raptor engine's combustion chamber, he said, turning to Dr. Whitman, whose expression had shifted from smugness to something less certain. The innovation isn't simply in the chamber geometry, though that's certainly part of it. His tone changed slightly, becoming more technical, but still accessible. Traditional rocket engines, including the Russian RD-180 that inspired us, use a stage combustion cycle, but with Raptor, we implemented a full-flow stage combustion cycle, something theorized for decades but never successfully built. Dr. Whitman blinked, clearly not expecting this level of detail. The engineering challenge wasn't just theoretical, it was practical. How to handle the extreme temperatures and pressures without material failure, particularly at the oxygen pump. Musk leaned forward slightly, hands moving now to illustrate the concepts. We had to redesign the turbopump bearings using a superalloy matrix that could withstand oxygen-rich conditions, something aerospace engineers had considered nearly impossible. He continued, with precise technical details. Fluid dynamics, calculations, metallurgical innovations, thermal management systems, all delivered with the fluency of someone who had lived and breathed these engineering challenges for years. Dr. Whitman's face transformed from skepticism to reluctant recognition, as Musk described specific engineering problems that only someone deeply involved in actual rocket development would understand. The chamber pressure in Raptor exceeds 300 bar, significantly higher than any operational rocket engine, which creates both challenges and efficiencies in our propellant utilization. Musk didn't speak like someone reciting memorized talking points, but like an engineer who had personally solved these problems through years of iteration and testing. Chen glanced nervously at her producer, who stood frozen off stage. This wasn't the fumbling response they had anticipated. This was a masterclass delivered with quiet confidence and undeniable expertise. So, to answer your question directly, Musk concluded, looking at Dr. Whitman, the innovations in our combustion chamber design aren't just incremental improvements. They represent fundamental rethinking of rocket engine architecture based on first principles physics. He paused briefly. Would you like me to elaborate further on the material science challenges or the computational fluid dynamics we use to optimize the injector pattern? Dr. Whitman swallowed visibly. That won't be necessary, he managed, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. Chen jumped in quickly, trying to regain control of the narrative. Let's shift to another area, she said, her practice poise slightly shaken. Your claims about artificial intelligence have been criticized by many experts as alarmist and uninformed. Rodriguez nodded eagerly, grateful for the pivot. You've predicted AI developments that specialists in the field consider unrealistic, showing what many view as a fundamental misunderstanding of the technology. Musk nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective, he said, his voice still calm. I've invested in AI research longer than almost anyone, co-founding OpenAI before most people took deep learning seriously. He leaned back slightly, completely at ease now. I've worked directly with pioneers like Demis Hassabis, Ilya Sutskever, and others, not as a passive investor, but as someone deeply engaged in the technical and philosophical questions. He looked directly at Rodriguez. The disagreement isn't about the technology itself. It's about the implications, about the potential trajectories, about the fundamental nature of artificial general intelligence. His explanation shifted from engineering to philosophy, from technical details to ethical frameworks, discussing concepts like recursive self-improvement, utility functions, goal alignment with the same fluency he had shown discussing rocket engines, the mathematics of reinforcement learning, the neural network architectures, the training methodologies. These aren't mysterious to me, he explained. My concerns aren't based on science fiction, but on understanding the technological possibilities, the game theory implications, the potential unintended consequences. Dr. Jeffries tried to interrupt, but Musk continued. I've spent thousands of hours with the world's top AI researchers, not just listening, but contributing to technical discussions about architecture, training methods, safety protocols. The audience was completely silent now, many leaning forward in their seats, captivated not by drama, but by substance, by the unexpected depth behind the headlines they had read. In fact, Musk added, reaching into his pocket, I brought something that might interest you. He withdrew a small notebook, worn and clearly well used. These are notes from 2015 when we were designing the first versions of GPT at OpenAI, He opened it, revealing pages of dense equations, diagrams, annotations. My personal notes on attention mechanisms, transformer architectures, token prediction, optimization. He handed it to Dr. Jeffries, who took it with visible surprise, flipping through pages filled with complex mathematical notations, technical sketches, questions scribbled in margins, all clearly written years before these concepts became widely known. These aren't talking points prepared for an interview, Musk said quietly. They're the actual work of someone trying to understand a complex technical field from first principles. Dr. Jeffries looked up from the notebook. Her expression transformed from academic superiority to genuine reassessment. This is quite detailed, she admitted, her voice carrying a new respect. Far more technical than I would have expected. She handed the notebook to Dr. Whitman, who studied it with growing discomfort, his earlier condescension evaporating. The equations for the attention mechanism are correctly formulated, he acknowledged reluctantly, And these margin notes? He pointed to Musk's handwritten questions. These are exactly the right questions about the limitations of the architecture. Chen watched in growing alarm as her expert panel transformed before her eyes, from prosecutors to colleagues sharing a technical discussion with someone they now recognized as legitimately knowledgeable. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. She tried again to redirect, but surely you can't claim expertise across all these different fields. Her voice carried a hint of desperation now. No single person could possibly have deep understanding of rocket engineering, battery technology, solar energy, artificial intelligence, neuroscience. Musk nodded in agreement. You're absolutely right, he said, surprising them again. No one person can know everything about these complex fields, including me. He gestured toward the notebook still being examined by the panelists. What I've developed isn't comprehensive expertise in every sub-discipline, but rather a framework for understanding complex technical fields rapidly by focusing on first principles. He leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. I don't need to know every detail of battery cathode manufacturing to understand enough electrochemistry to make key architectural decisions, to ask the right questions, to identify the limiting factors. He looked directly at Chen. There's a difference between superficial knowledge for show and practical knowledge for innovation, between memorizing facts and understanding principles. The audience stirred, many nodding in agreement. Rodriguez studied her notes, finding her prepared questions suddenly inadequate, irrelevant to the conversation that was actually taking place. Let me show you something else, Musk said, pulling out his phone. This is an engineering problem we solved last month at SpaceX. He handed the device to Dr. Whitman, displaying complex simulation results. This is the computational fluid dynamics model for our Starship heat shield, solving for re-entry plasma dynamics at hypersonic velocities. Dr. Whitman studied the screen, his expertise in physics allowing him to recognize the sophistication of the work. These simulations are impressive, he admitted, scrolling through the data. Who developed this model? Musk smiled slightly. The team built the simulation framework, but these specific parametric variations, the boundary conditions, the turbulence modeling adjustments, those were my contributions last Sunday afternoon. He said it without boasting, simply stating a fact. I still spend about 70% of my time on engineering and design, not on being a CEO. Chen watched in growing disbelief as her carefully orchestrated exposure transformed before her eyes into something entirely different. The energy in the studio had shifted completely from anticipation of a takedown to genuine fascination, even admiration. The producer was signaling frantically from offstage, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let this unexpected moment continue. But Chen hardly noticed. She was too busy watching her expert panel, her intellectual authorities, engage with Musk not as a fraud, but as a peer, as someone who spoke their language, understood their fields, asked the right questions. It wasn't supposed to be this way, but there was no denying what was happening before her eyes. Dr. Jeffries handed the notebook back, her expression completely transformed. I think perhaps, she said quietly, we've been asking the wrong questions. Musk accepted the notebook, slipping it back into his pocket. Perhaps, he agreed, without triumph or condescension. The right question isn't whether I have degrees or formal credentials, but whether I understand enough to make meaningful contributions, to lead teams of brilliant specialists, to see connections they might miss, to push beyond conventional limitations. He looked around at the panel, at Chen, at the audience beyond, and that question can only be answered by the results. Chen realized in that moment that everything had changed. What had begun as an ambush had become something else entirely, something none of them had expected. A genuine conversation about the nature of knowledge itself, about different paths to understanding, about what it means to truly know something, and what happened next would leave everyone in the studio rethinking their assumptions, not just about Elon Musk, but about expertise itself. The studio sat in stunned silence as the impossible unfolded before them. The panel of experts assembled to expose Elon Musk's limitations now sat in quiet respect, nodding as he explained complex technical concepts with undeniable fluency. The audience, once skeptical academics ready for blood, had transformed into captivated listeners, leaning forward or furiously taking notes. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was education. Chen's producer stood frozen at the edge of the stage, headset dangling as the carefully planned segments, provocations, and follow-ups became irrelevant. In the control room, directors exchanged panicked glances. "Do we cut to commercial?" one whispered. "I don't know. Ratings are spiking," another responded, as a network executive messaged, "Let it play out. This is compelling television." The first audience reaction came from a young graduate student in the third row, who stood and said, voice trembling, "I'm completing my PhD in aerospace engineering, and your explanation of propellant flow dynamics was clearer than my textbooks," sparking a ripple of applause from an audience meant to doubt him. Chen watched in disbelief as her own hand-picked skeptics engaged Musk with genuine curiosity. Dr. Whitman, who had arrived with contempt, now admitted, "Your approach to the turbopump design problem is unorthodox but elegant," to which Musk replied, "Orthodoxy can be the enemy of innovation." Dr. Jeffries, abandoning her prepared criticisms, confessed, "I came here expecting something different," as murmurs of agreement filled the room. Rodriguez, her journalistic skepticism fading, asked, "Why haven't you shared this side of your work before?" Musk, unfazed, answered, "I'm more interested in doing the work than talking about it. Media focuses on personality, controversy, spectacle, not the quiet technical work behind the scenes." Chen, grasping for control, stated, "I think what we're experiencing is a gap between perception and reality," to which Musk nodded, "That gap exists for most public figures. We reduce complex people to caricatures, but rarely accurately." The conversation flowed with rare authenticity. Phones emerged, capturing the moment, as viral captions spread. "Watch Elon Musk's school PhD panel," and "The moment academics realized they underestimated Musk." In the control room, a digital producer reported, "We're trending globally, viewership is climbing." Chen's producer, during a brief pause, whispered urgently, "We need to wrap, but the network wants to extend. This is gold." When Chen announced a commercial break for the first time, the audience groaned. When the cameras dimmed, instead of idle chatter, they stood and applauded, not the prompted applause of a studio audience, but genuine appreciation, Musk acknowledging it with a simple nod, no gloating, just quiet acceptance. During the break, Chen admitted, "This conversation took an unexpected turn," to which Musk, with a slight smile, replied, "Most interesting conversations do, when they're genuine." Dr. Whitman approached. "I'd like to continue our discussion on the Raptor engine cooling system." Musk nodded. "Happy to, but perhaps we've talked enough about rockets. There seem to be other questions out there." In the green room, stunned executives ordered, "Cancel the second segment. Extend this. This is the most authentic thing we've aired in years." As the floor director called, 90 seconds until we're back," Chen steadied herself, then, as the cameras lit, said, "Welcome back to the intellectual hour, where our conversation with Elon Musk has taken unexpected directions," glancing at her panelists, then Musk. "I think we've all had assumptions challenged tonight," the closest admission her pride allowed, but enough to mark the shift, the transformation, not just in the studio, but in living rooms across America, where viewers expecting a predictable takedown instead found themselves rethinking their assumptions, not just about Musk, but about expertise itself, knowledge, and the different paths to understanding a complex world. Something no one had scripted, no one had planned, but something everyone would remember long after the show had ended. As the conversation continued on screen, something remarkable happened in living rooms across America, in college dormitories, in airport lounges, in bars and restaurants. Wherever people gathered around televisions, the energy shifted. Viewers who had tuned in expecting another predictable takedown found themselves captivated by something altogether different, something authentic. Twitter erupted first, clips from the interview spreading faster than content moderators could track them. Ish Musk vs. experts trending within minutes, followed quickly by intellectual, humility, and first principles thinking. Comments flooded in from unexpected sources, professors who had previously criticized Musk acknowledging the depth of his responses, engineers confirming the accuracy of his technical explanations. A prominent AI researcher tweeted, "Watching Musk explain transformer architecture with that level of mathematical precision is making me rethink some assumptions," while an aerospace engineer added, His breakdown of full-flow stage combustion was textbook accurate but somehow clearer than any explanation I've seen. At MIT, a physics professor paused his evening class to stream portions of the interview. "This," he told his students, pointing to the screen, "is what it looks like when someone truly understands from first principles, not just from memorization." The students watched in silence, witnessing something that contradicted the narrative they had absorbed through years of media coverage. At Stanford's engineering department, a viewing party spontaneously formed, graduate students crowding into a lounge, many taking notes as Musk explained complex technical concepts with unusual clarity. "I've been skeptical of his technical claims," one doctoral candidate admitted, but his explanation of those CFD models was legitimately impressive. Across Silicon Valley, the interview became must-see content. Tech workers stopping meetings to gather around screens, many nodding in recognition as Musk described his approach to learning new technical domains. "That's exactly how learning works when you're building something new," a senior engineer at Google remarked. "Textbooks only get you so far, then you have to figure it out yourself." Even competitors acknowledged the unexpected demonstration of expertise, a senior executive at a rival car company texting colleagues, "No wonder Tesla moves so quickly. Their CEO actually understands the engineering trade-offs at a deep level." In newsrooms across the country, editors scrambled to adjust their framing as clips from the interview contradicted years of established narratives about Musk's technical background. "We need to revisit our coverage," one editor told his team. "This doesn't align with how we've characterized his expertise." At educational institutions, the interview was already being incorporated into next week's curriculum. At Harvard Business School, a professor emailed colleagues, "This is a case study in different paths to expertise, in the limitations of credentialism, in leadership that bridges technical and strategic thinking." By midnight Eastern Time, viewership data showed something unprecedented. People were finding and streaming the interview in numbers that broke platform records. Comment sections filling with variations of, "I've never seen anything like this on television. This is what genuine expertise looks like. Why can't we have more conversations like this?" A media studies professor explained the phenomenon to her late-night class. "What we're witnessing is the power of authenticity in a media landscape built on performance. Genuine knowledge stands out because it's become so rare." In Washington, D.C., policy advisors exchanged messages about potential implications. "If his technical understanding is this deep, maybe we should reconsider some of our assumptions about his companies." Even political commentators, normally quick to fit everything into partisan frameworks, found themselves at a loss. "This transcends the usual categories," one admitted on a late-night broadcast. "It's not about left or right. It's about depth versus superficiality, about understanding versus credentialism." At rival networks, emergency production meetings convened. "How do we respond to this?" one executive demanded. "It's completely changed the conversation." A producer shook his head. "We can't just go back to the same narratives, not after people have seen this." By morning, the wider impact was becoming clear. Academic journals were receiving submissions, analyzing the interview's implications for expertise, innovation, and education. Tech forums were filled with discussions about first principles thinking, about different paths to mastery, about the relationship between formal education and practical knowledge. Chen herself woke to find her social media flooded, not with the usual partisan reactions, but with thoughtful reflections on what the interview revealed about media, expertise, and intellectual humility. "Last night changed how I think about what we do," one viewer wrote. "It showed the difference between performing intelligence and actually demonstrating it." Dr. Whitman gave an interview to his university newspaper, showing remarkable candor. "I came with certain assumptions about Musk's technical understanding, and I was simply wrong," he admitted. His grasp of physics principles, of engineering challenges, of design trade-offs was genuinely impressive. Dr. Jeffries faced similar questions as students cited the interview in challenging some assertions in her book about tech leaders. "Academic inquiry requires us to revise our views when presented with new evidence," she told her class. "And what we saw last night is certainly new evidence." At SpaceX headquarters, employees exchanged knowing glances as media coverage exploded. "We've been trying to tell people for years," one engineer commented. "He's not just the money guy or the vision guy. He's deeply involved in the technical decisions." Another nodded. Remember that time he spotted the flaw in our control system calculations that all of us had missed? That's the guy we saw on TV last night. Tesla's engineering team experienced similar vindication. The public is finally seeing what we see, their chief vehicle engineer remarked. Someone who understands both the technical details and the big picture. But perhaps the most significant impact was happening in classrooms where teachers were already using clips from the interview to discuss different types of learning, different paths to understanding. Not everyone needs a PhD to contribute, a high school science teacher told her students. But everyone needs curiosity, persistence, and first principles thinking. Education forums lit up with discussions about the implications. Are we overvaluing credentials and undervaluing demonstrated knowledge? One thread asked, gathering thousands of responses. Parents reported conversations with children about different ways of learning, about questioning assumptions, about intellectual humility. My daughter wants to be an engineer, one mother wrote, and seeing someone explain complex concepts with such clarity was inspiring to her. Universities faced questions about the balance between theoretical knowledge and practical application, between specialized expertise and interdisciplinary understanding. This interview challenges us to rethink how we evaluate knowledge. A dean of engineering admitted, credentials matter, but they're not everything. Journalists who had covered Musk for years found themselves revisiting assumptions that had shaped their reporting. I think we've been asking the wrong questions, a technology reporter acknowledged in a surprisingly candid podcast appearance, focusing on his tweets, his personality, rather than the substance of his work. Even Chen was rethinking her approach to intellectual discourse as she watched viewership numbers continue to climb, as substantive think pieces replaced the gotcha headlines she had expected. The programming director called with unexpected news. Last night was our highest-rated episode ever, and the network wants to explore a new format based on what happened. She listened in surprise as he outlined a vision for more authentic intellectual exchange. Less confrontation, more exploration, less gotcha, more genuine curiosity. People are hungry for substance, he explained, for conversations that actually go somewhere, that illuminate rather than inflame. Across America, in universities and workplaces, in online forums and dinner tables, the conversation continued, not about who won or lost, not about politics or personalities, but about knowledge itself, about expertise and innovation, about the different paths to understanding our complex world. Something had shifted, perhaps subtly, perhaps temporarily, but undeniably. The interview had struck a chord, had revealed an appetite for substance over spectacle, for authentic understanding over credential-based authority. And as clips continued to spread, as viewership numbers climbed, as discussions deepened, it became clear that what had happened wasn't just a viral moment, wasn't just a clever response. It was a window into something essential, something many had forgotten in our credential-obsessed culture, that true understanding doesn't always come with degrees, doesn't always speak in academic language, but reveals itself undeniably when tested, when challenged, when given the space to demonstrate what it actually knows. 1 week after the interview that changed conversations across America, Elon Musk sat in his office at SpaceX, reviewing rocket engine designs much as he had done before, the media storm, the viral clips, the endless commentary. A young engineer entered, tablet in hand, hesitating slightly at the threshold. "Come in," Musk said, looking up from the schematics. "I wanted to thank you," the engineer said, voice slightly nervous. "For what happened on that show?" Musk raised an eyebrow questioningly. "My parents finally understand what I've been telling them about working here," the engineer explained. "They thought I was exaggerating about your technical involvement, but after seeing that interview, they get it now." Musk nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Glad it helped," he said simply before returning to the designs. The moment was brief, but it captured something essential about what had happened, how a single authentic exchange had shifted perceptions, not through carefully crafted messaging, but through genuine demonstration. Across the country, similar conversations were taking place in classrooms where teachers were using clips from the interview to discuss different types of intelligence, different paths to expertise, different ways of understanding our complex world. The most important thing we learned, a high school physics teacher told her students, isn't about rocket engines or AI. It's about how knowledge actually works. the students listened attentively, more engaged than usual. Formal education provides frameworks, methodologies, foundations, but deep understanding often comes from something else entirely. She played a clip from the interview, where Musk explained his process of learning new technical fields from first principles. Notice how he doesn't just know facts, she pointed out. He understands the underlying principles, the relationships between concepts, the why behind the what. At Stanford University, a professor of education was leading a faculty discussion about the implications. This challenges our entire credential system, he acknowledged, raises fundamental questions about how we recognize and validate knowledge. His colleagues nodded, some uncomfortable with the implications, others energized by the possibilities. Perhaps our focus on degrees and publications has created blind spots in how we evaluate understanding, one suggested, especially in rapidly evolving fields where textbooks are outdated almost as soon as they're published. Meanwhile, in newsrooms across the country, editors were revisiting guidelines about how they covered technical subjects, how they evaluated expertise. "We need more humility in our reporting," one editor told his team, recognizing that credentials aren't everything, that understanding comes in different forms, that our preconceptions can limit what questions we ask, what answers we hear. A journalist who had covered tech for decades wrote a surprisingly candid piece. "What the Musk interview taught me about my own intellectual blind spots," acknowledging how her assumptions had shaped her coverage, had closed her to certain possibilities, had reinforced existing narratives at the expense of accuracy. Rebecca Chen herself was experiencing her own reassessment as she prepared for a new format that her network had enthusiastically approved: intellectual explorations. Focused not on gotcha moments, not on confrontation for its own sake, but on genuine exchange of ideas, on challenging assumptions, on intellectual curiosity. That interview showed us what's possible when we prioritize understanding over performance, she told her production team, when we actually listen instead of just waiting to attack. Even Dr. Whitman, the physicist who had come armed with technical questions designed to expose ignorance, found himself reflecting on the experience in a guest lecture at Princeton. "I was wrong," he admitted to the students, "not just about Musk's technical understanding, but about something more fundamental, about how expertise can develop outside traditional pathways." He paused, considering his words carefully. "The academic in me wants to say this is an exception, an outlier, but the scientist in me knows when data challenges your hypothesis, you must reconsider your assumptions." Across social media, the conversation continued evolving, moving beyond the specific interview to broader questions about knowledge and understanding, about different forms of intelligence, about the relationship between credentials and actual ability. "What I found most revealing," wrote a popular science educator, "wasn't Musk's technical knowledge itself, but how he connects concepts across disciplines, seeing relationships that specialists often miss." Another commentator added, "Traditional education teaches us to categorize, to specialize, to stay in our lanes, while first principles thinking teaches us to see the common patterns, the underlying physics, the transferable insights." Parents reported conversations with children about different ways of learning, about questioning assumptions, about intellectual curiosity. "My son, who struggles in traditional classrooms, watched that interview 5 times, one mother shared, and told me, that's how my brain works too. I need to understand why, not just memorize how." But perhaps the most profound impact was happening quietly in how people evaluated information, in how they thought about expertise, in how they approached learning itself. A subtle shift was occurring from credential worship to substance evaluation, from accepting authority to questioning assumptions, from passive consumption to active understanding. "The real lesson here isn't about Musk," a philosophy professor wrote in an essay that was shared hundreds of thousands of times. "It's about our relationship with knowledge itself, about how we decide what's true, who to trust, what to believe," he continued. "For too long, we've outsourced our thinking to credentials, to institutions, to authorities, without developing our own capacity for first principles reasoning, for intellectual discernment." The essay sparked thousands of responses from people reconsidering their own intellectual journeys, their own relationship with expertise, their own capacity for deeper understanding. I realized I've been intimidated by credentials my whole life, one reader commented. Believing people with PhDs must know better even in areas where my practical experience gave me insights they might not have. Another added, this made me question how often I dismiss perspectives that don't come packaged in the right academic language, from people with the right titles, from institutions with the right reputations. Even educators were reassessing their assumptions about intelligence, about how knowledge develops, about different paths to understanding. We tend to confuse education with intelligence, a cognitive scientist explained. Confuse credentials with comprehension. Confuse specialized vocabulary with actual understanding. And so, the conversation continued, rippling outward, touching unexpected corners of society, raising questions that transcended the specific interview, the specific personalities involved, questions about knowledge itself, about how we learn, about how we evaluate understanding, about the different paths to mastery and innovation. So, what does this mean for you? What lessons can we take from this unexpected moment that captivated millions? Perhaps it's about approaching knowledge differently, with more humility about what we know, with more curiosity about what we don't, with more openness to different paths, to understanding our complex world. Perhaps it's about recognizing that true expertise isn't about credentials, isn't about titles or institutions, but about demonstrated understanding, about the ability to explain complex concepts in ways that illuminate rather than obscure. Perhaps it's about developing our own capacity for first principles, thinking, for questioning assumptions, for seeing beyond conventional wisdom to the underlying truths that conventional wisdom often misses. In your own life, in your own learning journey, how might this perspective shift your approach? How might it change your relationship with expertise, with authority, with your own capacity for understanding? The next time you encounter someone whose background doesn't fit your expectations, whose path doesn't match conventional routes, will you dismiss their perspective, or will you evaluate it on its merits? The next time you face a complex problem, will you immediately outsource your thinking to recognized authorities, or will you try to understand the fundamentals, the first principles that might lead to unexpected solutions? These are the questions that linger long after the viral clips have faded from feeds, the questions that matter, not just for how we view Elon Musk or any individual, but for how we approach knowledge itself in an increasingly complex world, where conventional expertise alone may not be enough to solve our most pressing challenges, where combining deep understanding across traditional boundaries may be exactly what we need. The interview reminded us of something essential, something we perhaps always knew but had forgotten in our credential-focused culture, that understanding comes in many forms, that curiosity matters more than conformity, that what you actually know will always matter more than where or how you learned it. If this story inspired you to think differently about expertise, about learning, about knowledge itself, don't just like and subscribe, though we certainly appreciate that too. But take that inspiration into your world, question your assumptions, pursue understanding not just information, and remember that the most powerful intellectual tool isn't a degree or a title, but the capacity to think from first principles, to see what others miss, to understand deeply rather than simply memorize broadly. That's the real lesson of the interview that shocked a studio, changed a conversation, and reminded millions of viewers what genuine understanding actually looks like in a world too often satisfied with its counterfeits.